Hi there. So, our research proposal was on demographics and sex trafficking. So, this was by Kayla Zooks and myself, Maddie Scribner. So, for our statement of the problem, we focused on an individual's demographic and their correlation to exposure and their involvement of sex trafficking. So, we wanted to look into how one's demographic or where they're living can increase the risk of sex trafficking. And so, sex trafficking is coerced sex, it is forced labor, or acts of servitude. And it's even reported in the National um, Human Trafficking Hotline that there were 11,500 human trafficking instances in 2019 alone. So, as you can tell, it is a very large issue. Something that we wanted to see is if one's population or living situation has anything to do with that. And so, some societal implications based on demographics that we discussed, and will be discussed in some slides ahead, is economic declines, mental and physical health disparities, criminal rate, at risk youth, and technological exposure. So, in our hypothesis, we cover a lot of this. But we wanted to see what the implications in society or what one's situation is like in their demographic area that could increase sex trafficking exposure. So, for the literature review, we found a few things. So, first, we found that there is a lot of lack of findings of those in the trade. So this could be for a variety of reasons. So a main reason we found was that those are uncomfortable coming forward, which is very understandable. So those that have experienced sex trafficking may not feel comfortable, telling somebody, reporting it, finding that assistance because they may not be ready. So that is a huge population that they figured that was not accounted for. And then additionally, it's those that are simply unknown. So that kind of goes along with those that are uncomfortable, possibly, but those that are unknown that may still be in the trade that didn't realize that they were being sex trafficked, things like that. That also aren't accounted for in the findings in the literature review. And then we also looked at the risk and protective factors of human trafficking. And so, first, we did find in the literature review that demographics plays a huge role in the risk of sex trafficking, especially those in higher populated areas. So that kind of confirmed what our thoughts were and what our hypothesis is going to be, which will be discussed next. That demographics do play a role in the risk of sex trafficking. Additionally, we found that protective factors played a role, such as resilience and survival factors. So, this could be learned traits that an individual has, positive experiences they had growing up that effectively, reduce their risk to trafficking, things like that. But overall resilience of a human being is profound and can be a protective barrier for human trafficking. And lastly, childhood experiences is a big risk and possibly protective factor of human trafficking. So, unfortunately, a lot of adolescents and youth are the victims of human trafficking, and usually women. And so, this is something we wanted to look at is if adverse childhood experiences played a role, and it did, according to the literature reviews. And so these adverse childhood experiences include, maybe living in single parent households, divorce rates, domestic abuse in the house, and things like that. This can also be not attending school. It could be being involved in, criminal activity, owning weapons. Maybe they have experienced neglect or abuse, either physical, emotional, any type of abuse is a risk factor for human trafficking. And so that's why it's very important to, address these childhood experiences, especially when it's youth and in the school system, to see these correlations. And overall, this plays a role in demographics as well because a lot of these higher populations have adverse childhood experiences and may be prone to resilience and survival skills or a lack thereof. And lastly, for our literature review, we found that the use of internet is something that involves sex trafficking. So through advertising services such as, job posting sites and even dating websites, gaming websites, the dark web, things like that, that youth are also involved in. and maybe those links that you're not entirely sure if you should click on. Those are things that sex traffickers have found a gateway to, and law enforcement in our literature review said that it has replaced visible prostitution. So this is a great risk for sex trafficking as well that was discovered in our literature review. And so next we came up with the 3 hypotheses. So first, our hypothesis was communities with higher populations have an increased risk and trend of sex trafficking. So essentially, as discussed before, that when one lives in a higher population, there is that increased risk of being vulnerable to sex trafficking. And that can be for a variety of reasons. So it can be because of the increased criminal rates in higher populations. There's a lack of policing efforts. There's a lack of financial support that one can have, lack of resources, things such as that can overall increase the risk of sex trafficking. Our next hypothesis was communities with an increased rate of poverty, homelessness, or diversity have an increased amount of sex trafficking. So this one is interesting because it also relates with higher populations because there is higher rates of poverty, homelessness, and diversity in higher populations. But specifically for this, we came up with this being an increased rate because first, when lower poverty, there's increased vulnerabilities, and especially with generational poverty. I mean, when we take the example of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, there is segregational poverty, especially through housing. And so when we say diversity, more so that is because there is that form of segregation through income and housing and homelessness, especially as it affects the Black population and Hispanic population. That increased vulnerabilities to sex trafficking unfortunately affects that area. And that's usually where you see the higher crime rates. That's where you see drug and alcohol abuse. That can also play hand in hand with adverse childhood outcomes. And so our third hypothesis was individuals, specifically youth, have an increased amount of sex trafficking rates due to the increase in internet use and advancements in technology. So essentially this one's pretty self-explanatory, but the increased use of the internet, a lack of safeguards, a lack of knowledge of how to maybe use the internet, of what links you should click on, a lack of education knowing how to work the internet, things like that. But then also just the risk of being on the internet, of clicking things that you didn't realize were, a gateway to sex trafficking, or even simply being involved in it through dating websites, meeting up with strangers, things like that. Especially youth have an increased risk of sex trafficking. And so for our research design and measurement, we came up with formulating structured interviews. So this would be formulated through medical and legal records to identify victims, and this would all remain confidential, and we decided to break it into 3 different sections of interviewing. So first, it would be interviewing on demographics. So that is through identifying their age, their citizenship, race, ethnicity, gender, location, things like that. The second section would be internet use, how much internet they use. So how many hours spent online a day, what kind of apps and websites do you have you ever met with a stranger before that you met online? And then the third section would be focusing on socioeconomics. So that would be what kind of education have you had or are you in? What's your occupation? What's your salary? What's your personal history? What's your living situation like? Things like that. And so finally, our measurement would be through cross-data analysis, and this would be done primarily to observe victims and traffickers at a single point in time. And this would also allow us to kind of pool together the traffickers and victims into one population to be able to identify and structure those interviews.